Welcome to Testing in the Pub.
Welcome to another Testing in the Pub. Unfortunately, there's no Steve, but don't worry, you don't have to listen to just me rambling because we've got Alan Parkinson. Alan, cheers.
Cheers, Dan.
We're in a pub.
Yes, it's great. Who knew that Testing the Pub was recorded in a pub?
I know, it's true. So, for those that don't know who you are, tell us a bit about you.
I've been in the industry for 14 plus years now. It might even be 15. I actually started off as a developer, and I got involved in testing later on in my career, but I've also been a product owner. I've been an agile consultant. Actually, that's a really bad word to use, consultant. Coach,
trainer?
Yeah, advisor, maybe. I moved from development to being interested in testing because I was fed up of working on projects where we're delivering working software. The software wasn't meeting the business needs, so the software project was technically considered a failure. And I put sort of the entrepreneurial hats I sometimes wear on. It's like, why is the business paying us to build this stuff, and we keep missing what we should be building? So I thought testing was the answer, and it turns out it wasn't. But I had great fun. So what I learned in the end was that it actually takes testers, developers, business analysts if they're involved, or any other stakeholders to work as a team.
Yeah.
And jointly have a goal of delivering the software. And none of this back and forwards and siloed nature and arguing amongst ourselves about we should be applying this process over that process, etc. Actually delivering working software that meets the business need is key.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So tell us a little bit about Hindsight. How did Hindsight form, and what do you actually do? I know that you develop some tools, but the coaching and training side of things as well.
So it would have been when I was an agile sort of coach 3-4 years ago. I was working with a lot of companies on applying behaviour-driven development because I do have a bit of a background on the automation side, given I've been a developer in previous roles. And I saw a lot of companies, the testers and developers were really getting involved in BDD, but the business wasn't getting involved. And I was looking at why isn't the business getting involved, because BDD is often about the requirements, not automation, which is a common mistake people make. So I founded Hindsight because I saw that the business wasn't getting involved and I wanted to solve that problem. One of the things we've done is we've created a tool called Behave Pro that allows the business to work with the developers and testers in an environment they're familiar with. And we also do the coaching to actually help people get going, because a lot of people, there's sort of myths around there, people don't know where to get started, there's lots of common pitfalls, and we want to help people be successful.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. But tell us more about BDD then, right? Because the terminology is well known, but do people actually know about BDD? We'll come on to the misconceptions in a bit, but tell us a bit about BDD first, and why to use it, when to use it.
Okay, so tiny bit of history. So BDD has been around for 11 years now, but it has morphed over that time. Central concept is actually the same, but it's actually morphed from a way of helping you to express proper test. I'm using the word from TDD point of view of test, not test as we know as testers.
Yep.
Of writing good titles for your TDD tests. Actually come up with a way of doing that, and it's actually evolved into a sort of analysis technique of actually discovering, having a conversation with the business and capturing the information about what they want. So the key part of BDD is examples or scenarios, and for each user story you're meant to come up with a set of scenarios that actually show the user story in action in different situations and what results you expect. Examples are a better communication tool than somebody writing down an abstract acceptance criteria rule.
So it's not examples of test scenarios, it's examples of the requirement, right?
It's examples of the behaviour.
Okay.
This goes into where people make common mistakes. They start treating them as test cases rather than how the software should behave, and that's the mental change you need to make.
Okay, so that's kind of leading into the who with BDD, who's involved and who writes these examples?
Okay, so for the best success with BDD, you need the three amigos, or what's commonly referred to as three amigos. So that's the business stakeholder, so that could be the product owner or business analysts, or both, depending on the structure of your project, developers and testers, because there can be a lot of ambiguity between the communication between the three roles, often referred to it as some projects being built on Chinese whispers for your requirements, because you have people communicating with each other. And when they go and talk to somebody else about the requirements, they change it slightly. So having all three roles there, you can actually discuss the examples, and different people can start asking different questions about it. And if you're asking questions about it, you're uncovering uncertainty, ambiguities. You can correct those then, actually document them. Everybody has a complete understanding before you start work on a user story. If everybody has understanding, you've got a good chance of success. You can have the best developers and testers in the world. If your requirements are wrong, they're still going to produce the wrong thing.
It's really interesting actually, because I utilise Three Amigos and we are pushing to utilise BDD, right? Well, with these feature files, with the scenarios and the requirement examples, right? But it's kind of, we have the Three Amigo conversations and then we'll go away and write the scenarios. But we should really be doing that as part of the Three Amigo conversations, right?
It can be difficult while having the conversation to document it. If there's just three of you around the water cooler in the kitchen, it's easier. But if you've got one person delegated as scribe, they're not actually involved in the conversation so much. So sometimes I'll actually record the conversation on a dictaphone and actually just play it back and write it up and get everybody to review it.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I know.
You must have hours and hours every day of these conversations though on a dictaphone.
I do, but a dictaphone, you can either use your phone, it's really cheap, or you can pick up one for £15 that plug in to your USB port. You can even attach those MP3 files to your Jira issues.
That's really interesting. Useful tools. We learn a new tool every day, don't we? Okay, so what's the main purpose of BDD? Is it to refine requirements then, or is it to help with the automation behind these requirements, or? Okay,
so I always start off with crediting Liz Keogh on this. She did a great tweet, and it goes along the lines of having the conversation is more important than capturing the conversation, which is more important than automating the conversation. So having the discussion is the most important thing about the user story. Writing it is the second most important thing. And then if you do automation and create, as it were, acceptance tests or acceptance checks, as we should really call it, is the actual last thing. So it's actually getting the requirements right is the top two elements of that.
So technically, in that sense, you could be doing BDD without having feature files?
Correct.
Right.
We actually write our scenarios directly onto our user stories, and then we'll cross-reference them to a feature file.
Right.
So user stories are not features. User stories can cut across several features. They're delivering a particular requirement at a moment in time.
Yep.
And features are really used for documenting the system and organising it.
In a sense, user stories are kind of like value chunks, right? Value chunks of...
I need this value now, it's the most important thing. Later on, it's going to be something else.
Okay, that's cool. That's kind of setting things in my head for how I'm trying to do feature files and have these Three Amigo conversations and speak about the requirements. So it's good to know that I'm on the right track.
Good.
So let's talk about the when then. We've spoke about the Three Amigo conversations and they generally happen. In Agile, you've kind of got your backlog grooming, sizing, planning. Does it happen all three of those sort of stages before the work's actually pulled into the sprint?
Okay.
Or?
Lots of teams work in doing Scrum or other processes differently, so I'm going to generalize slightly here. So normally the product owner is meant to come with 2 sprints worth of user stories to discuss with the team during planning. Now, sometimes it can be difficult, particularly when the product owner's getting going, actually to write some initial scenarios down. So quite often the team will probably work through these scenarios and actually discuss them before they do their estimates and planning. Because you can't estimate accurately if you don't know the full scope of a user story. One way of doing it on user stories is as soon as you get lots of scenarios come out, because there's lots of hidden information that you've suddenly uncovered from the product owner. Testers using their critical thinking skills to actually test the requirements rather than the software. You quite often find that you'll need to split up a user story. So you can't accurately estimate without doing that.
A lot of people tend to have that problem with estimations because there's initially they're just based on that information that you know up front, and you'll always learn more, right? So you'll always learn more about the product and about the software when you use it even as well. So I guess these feature files are, you start them up front with the living documentation, right?
Yes, you can turn them into living documents.
Yeah, that's cool. And what about storing these, and what about the automation behind it then? Like, obviously with feature files, you've got that automation place behind it, right?
Yes, if you write in a particular format, you've got lots of tools available, lots of open source tools available that can turn these into automated acceptance checks.
So what's the purpose of having that automation then? Is it just to essentially do those checks to conform against the requirements, or because I hear a lot of people saying that like feature files are used for regression testing purposes as well, so
lots of people do use them for regression testing or regression checking rather from the requirements to actually make sure past user stories we delivered still hold true. Other teams work in what's called outside-in development, and this is taking sort of TDD, but taking it from the requirements level. So if you have your scenarios as a developer on your user story, you can actually pair with a tester maybe, and actually start to work on the first scenario. You start to write the automation for that scenario. It fails because your software doesn't actually meet that functionality yet. So you code one of the first couple of steps, and maybe it's failing. Right? So and then you go down and actually implement the functionality in your application. Then that step passes in your scenario. You move on to the next step in the scenario, and you can actually build out, and then you can use it as an understanding of when you've actually functionally completed the story.
See that? I see that. It's kind of like TDD with unit testing level, right? But how would that work with legacy software? Kind of like where you're implementing a new feature to existing software. Where your feature files, are they going to just focus on that new feature? What about the integration with the existing software as well? And you won't have that sort of ability to write the checks first and then implement with the integration, right?
You'd still have to. So there would be some setup code if you're working with a legacy system. But you're always going to have a setup cost if you want to do any form of automation with a legacy system. Even a greenfield project, just happens the greenfield project is probably less code,
right?
Because you don't have much to work against at that point. So you're going to have to do that whatever. If you're going to do we've learned a lot of lessons from people trying to automate legacy systems and as a regression suite. And I always say that's a bad idea, because the best thing to do is actually focus on areas of the system that actually deliver value. One way of doing that is as soon as you touch an area of the system, that's where you start to put your automation in. So it could be fixing a bug. You perhaps want to check to guard against that. But if you're writing new functionality, and you're touching functionality around it, you can actually put in your existing checks, the existing functionality, and document what it does now, and add the new functionality and so you can then see that it still does the old functionality as well as the new functionality. You've got to take it a piecemeal approach. You can't go out and just backport everything.
But it's about refactoring those areas that you're touching as well, right? And then introducing the TDD and BDD approach around about the refactoring that you're doing as well. So,
and you don't have to do that. There's nothing saying that you have to automate BDD. Unfortunately, it's the way that people have come to it.
Then there's a problem with misconceptions if people believe that feature files are for regression testing purposes, because then if you don't have the automation and they're being used for regression, manual regression, then it's pretty much a test case, right?
Yes.
And I've seen situations where the feature file has like had given and all those ands are data setup that aren't actually relevant to the feature. It's data set up with other legacy parts of the system that you have to set up so that you can then test the feature. Do you know what I mean? So
yes.
It's kind of confusing the purpose of the feature file. So
what people do is often write a given step that sets up a lot of that data with sensible defaults, so they don't have to specify it in the feature file.
Yeah.
And in the scenarios, that's one way of doing it.
Yeah. So you're kind of adding that to the background, or?
You can, background is for, we're getting into sort of the details of Gherkin here.
Yeah, that's true.
Given when then format feature files. But background is for reuse of common setup within a feature. You can actually push into a single step or one or two steps a lot of common setup using sensible default values for data.
See, I've always thought that if you're writing a given when-then scenario or example, I prefer the word example actually. I'm going to start using example.
Yeah, you should do. Specification by example is an alternative name for BDD, and it's actually a name I prefer, just more people have heard of BDD.
I'm definitely starting using example. So if you're thinking about given when-then examples, then, right, what I tend to do is just focus on that feature the feature file is relevant for, right? So it's kind of like I don't include any of the setup information because I'm kind of viewing it as a requirement, not as a test case.
Yeah, you're
right?
thinking of the behavior.
Yeah.
Not a test case, yeah. It's the common thing people need to switch from thinking of how am I going to test this to how it should behave.
It's design documentation. So, okay, so can we get an example of the how with BDD? I know that we've touched on what it is, why it's useful, who should write it. We've spoken a little bit about feature files, but what else is involved? How would someone incorporate BDD if they wanted to do it, like, say, tomorrow?
Okay, so the first thing is, before you start working on the user story, is actually hold that conversation I was describing earlier with the product owner and the developers. Even if you can't get the product owner involved at first, still have it with the developers, so you as a tester and the developer can have a common understanding between you. You know, if you think of that whole argument between developers and testers, is it a bug or not a bug? You know, I'd actually say you're both right and you're both wrong. Because if there's an ambiguity over it, it's actually a requirements issue.
That's still a bug, right? A bug is anything that threatens the value of the product.
So the product owner has to decide that. The product owner has to decide that.
Okay, well, it's a problem.
It's a problem.
Let's not call it a problem. Bugs are problems.
Yeah. Well,
anything that's considered a problem that might not be a bug.
How I define a bug is it affecting the value, the purpose of the software?
Yeah.
Like, you can start going into the argument whether grammar errors are bugs or not, and it actually does depend on the context of your application. I know one very large teleco company that had one system where it always calculated VAT wrong by 1 pence, but because it was an internal application doing a very small function, all staff were trained to add the 1 pence, so they didn't actually bother fixing it.
Yeah, technically it's still a bug. It's still a problem, but it's a problem that they're willing to live with, so it's a low
It's not
priority.
compromising the value to them.
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting. Because I've also had conversations with the kind of the opposite dimension of that, where people have been saying, well, it's not broken code, so it's not a bug. Do you know what I mean? But it's kind of, well, actually, it's grey text on a grey background, so it's not very readable. So it might not be broken code, but it still threatens the value, right? So interesting. Anyway, carry on with this.
How? Okay, so the important thing is to actually have the conversations. We've covered that earlier. Even if you just build up the common understanding between developer and tester, and because you're using natural language to describe these examples, and that's one advantage that Gherkin and the automation tools Cucumber and the other tools give you, it can be very easy for the business to get involved at a later date. You can actually start to show them And this comes into one of the misconceptions of that people think, oh, the product owner can write our tests for us because it's all natural language.
Yeah.
And I hear that one a lot.
business.
Yeah, or the business.
Or customers themselves.
Yes. And that does not work. It only works in a handful of cases. But they can be involved if it's written in natural language and written in a suitable way. So you've got to think about the style of writing them. Again, how it behaves, not how we're going to test it. So if you start writing it as a test script, it becomes really difficult and really boring to read, and you'll never get the business involved.
That's interesting. Can you give us an example scenario, or an example?
Okay, an example. Okay, so I can actually probably take one out of our product straight off the top of my head. This should be fun.
Put you in the spot now.
Oh yeah. So, given Nick has a user story and he's marked the user story is ready, when he opens a question on the user story, then Nick's approval should actually be cancelled.
Okay, that's interesting. Who's Nick?
So Nick is our user of a system. So in this case, he's actually a persona. He's a persona of our end user.
So does Nick represent a type of user?
So Nick does actually represent a type of user. He actually represents a product owner for us.
Okay, interesting, because everyone in your product has the same user privileges, right?
Generally, yes.
Yeah, so...
But it's one user. You've got particular roles that might do an operation more than others. Sometimes there's a generalized role. You can actually then, with perhaps not mention Nick, but actually use a decorated role. So you put an adjective in front of the role.
Yeah.
So what somebody's trying to achieve. But we actually prefer using personas because we actually want to try and great thing about personas and using scenarios, when you actually come to test a piece of software, you can actually start acting and pretending to be that person. Because if you've got a persona, you've got a whole background about that person, what they like doing, what's their goals and motivations, how knowledgeable they are about, how comfortable they are using software. You can actually role play them.
That's really interesting. I'm going to start using personas in my feature files as well. But where do you document that persona? Do you keep it in with the actual feature file, or the step definitions, or?
No, we have that as a separate artifact as part of our project.
Okay.
So typically they're sort of developed by the product owner, but I think the team should actually drive this, because the product owner is quite often the person working and proxying your customers or your end users, so they actually know the different groups. And it's creating personas about going out and actually interviewing people. And when you've got lots of people sort of saying the same thing, forming a common group, that's when you create a persona for that person.
That's quite good. I can see that being quite useful, because you're actually turning it into even more of a readable sort of language, right?
Yeah.
You can then associate it with real life.
Yeah, you can you're humanizing it.
Yeah, exactly.
You're no longer talking about the user, you're talking about Roy or Nick.
Yeah.
Or Samantha.
That's quite cool. So tell us more about the misconceptions then. We've touched on them previously, what are the main ones?
So the big elephant in the room one is that BDD is about test automation. Everybody gets to use Cucumber. It's, oh yeah, we've got a test automation tool that we can write natural language into, and we're going to automation. Non-technical people can automate tests, and people would sort of get the misconception that perhaps testers who don't want to code, which is a whole another separate subject, which I do have strong opinions on, can actually get involved. And
I'm so tempted to jump in here, man. Testers that don't want to code, or testers that don't want to read code?
You've been to one of my talks, so my opinion is reading code and writing code is quite different.
Yep.
Actually being able to write code well takes
difficult.
many years to learn. You've got to understand different patterns. You've got to understand when to use dry and when to apply solid principles. So it takes a lot of years to learn and practice to maintain. We run an apprenticeship program at Hindsight, so we teach people about programming. We know it. I've been a programmer. I know how difficult it is. So perhaps you've got testers who can actually perhaps script. Also know testers who can code really, really well and do really great automation. But I think saying people should be able to code, I think it's sort of pigeonholing, and you could get mixed results if you start to rely on it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with people with good critical thinking, good exploratory test skills actually working on a project. You did lots of different viewpoints on the requirements, but also at Hindsight, we don't automate all our scenarios. We do rely on a lot of exploratory testing. We don't rely on huge amounts of regression checks. We rely on quite a lot of exploratory, pretending to be our users.
Yeah, I mean, usually I normally see sort of a misconception where people say you have to learn how to code, but what they really mean is you have to have some technical skills, right? But not necessarily meaning coding,
Yes.
right? But I mean, you're a developer and a tester and a business owner, right?
Yeah.
And a coach, right? So have you seen in your experience that when you've got the developer hat on, you're thinking differently because you're thinking more constructively, right? Whereas when you're testing, you kind of got this destructive element where you're not thinking about how can I build this, but how can I break it, right? Well, not that you're breaking it, but the different ways that it might break, right?
Yes. So quite often, because I'm driving on what my scenarios are, so I don't get to code that much.
Right.
It's very rarely to code nowadays.
When you did though.
Because I'm working to my scenario,
Yeah.
I'm implementing the functionality around that. So hopefully I thought about most of the edge cases before then. But I do my work and then I sort of put my tester hat on and go back retrospectively and apply it. So you are right in that. But as I'm going along, I do think of cases.
Yeah.
I don't always think of them up front. It might be...
You're thinking about the variables really, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to implement the variables and think about that as you're going along. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, right, okay, so if I'm writing code for automation, right, because I know a little bit of Ruby, I know a little bit of Water, so I can write some automation to manipulate a browser, right, but still I'm thinking that destructive way of how it might fail, and then I'm trying to manipulate the web browser to try and discover information about these sort of variables, right, but I wouldn't feel confident at all, and I wouldn't know how to go about building software from that developer point of view, right? So it's two different skills, I would say. Right?
Yes, it is different skills, and you can learn them, but it's a significant multi-year investment.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important part. I go, can somebody get a job with me as a coder? And so a tester tells me they can code, I would run the same interview with them as a coder.
Okay, right, that's cool, that's a good explanation. So, we've covered quite a lot actually. We've covered about BDD, what it is, why use it, who should be involved and when, and how as well, and that was a good example, using a persona. And we've spoken more about feature files and I guess the automation behind them. And
we've mentioned automation.
Yeah.
And it does rely on the strong coding skills. Good application of design patterns, like page object pattern, test data builder pattern. It's difficult to build maintainable automation. So we'll actually sometimes if we know an area in application is not going to change frequently, after we've written the automation, after a while we'll throw that bit away because every single bit does become if it's done well, a small burden and overhead when making changes. Done well, it's a small burden. Done wrong, incorrectly, major burden. And I've seen automation go wrong where it takes so long to change a single feature because of the amount of automation that needs to be fixed.
I've seen that type of automation as well, where it's like the automation is done based on that single feature file, right? And it's not a framework really, it's just automating that single feature file. So nowhere else, you might have that feature, take pagination for example, right? Pagination is using so many different pages, but the code might sit within that feature file for that pagination on that single page, and then it might sit under a different feature file for that rather than be using. So
that code wouldn't sit under feature files. It is very much in the automation layer, and it should be abstracted in a correct way.
Oh yeah, of course it's not.
And that's where the developers actually do know.
File, but it's sitting. What I mean is like there's a step diffs with like you've got your feature file, and then you've got your step defs, and then you've got your automation. Do you know what I mean? That sits.
What I was trying to get at is you'd apply correct abstraction so you could do reuse.
Yeah.
And that's where developer skills do come in for automation. I'd actually recruit developers to do automation because I don't see it actually as a testing role.
Yeah.
You're not applying critical thinking to actually construction of automation.
The best way is really with pairing, isn't it? With having a developer and a tester.
Oh yeah. Pairing's so great.
But that's the same with everything. That's the same with TDD with unit tests. You know, it's kind of like pairing to talk about the variables and scenarios around those variables. So
you could think of the Three Amigos workshop as pairing on steroids, because you got to.
Yes, really.
You know,
it's not
you've
really
got more people.
With three, though. What would you call that?
That's why it's on steroids.
Trailing.
Yeah, I know. I need to come up with a name for that. But it's the same benefit. You're actually having extra sets of eyes looking over something and collaborating on something.
Yeah. Okay. Tell us about tools.
Okay.
What's the best BDD tools out there?
Ooh.
Is there? Can I say BDD tools? Is there BDD tools? It's not really a tool. It's more like a process, right?
Well, yes, it's a technique.
Yeah.
I call it a technique or a method. So you've got tools that support it. So most popularly the Gherkin family of tools, which Cucumber was the very first of. So people remember that from Ruby, and it's probably the tool they come across first.
Yep.
Very similar to that format is you've got JBehave, which is the very first tool that supported it. It even goes right back to the TDD days of BDD, not just the high-level user story sort of accept scenario or example, sort of that modern tools do. I would suggest to a team, if they're adopting a tool and they want to do automation, go for one in the Gherkin family. So that's Cucumber JVM for the Java languages, SpecFlow, you've got Bhat, which is PHP, and you've got Behave and Lettuce, which are in Python, because they all take the same feature files in the same format. JBehave can be made to work with them, but it does allow you to switch between tools. And then I'd suggest choosing a tool that you write your main code base is written in.
Right.
So you can get your developers involved easily.
So there is a range of tools, and each sort of focus on a different language. Yeah. So it's just really whatever language you develop in, choose that.
Yes. So you can get help from the developers.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
It's also when you start, you can reuse. So what we haven't discussed is you don't have to automate everything with BDD. Your scenarios aren't covering every single edge case that you'd come up with as a tester. It's not going to check every single the validation rules on every single input field of a form.
Where is the line, right? Because you could really go into a lot of detail.
You could do. You want to describe the important functionality of the software. So every single
so you're not
bad path you don't want to test, check and describe. You want to pick out the important ones that are of significant value and key ones. And then what I suggest, if you do want to do automation for the others, use a tool like a unit-based test, typically a unit test tool like JUnit. And you can actually reuse the automation from, say, Cucumber JVM, because they all support the same programming language. You can actually, all these abstractions that you can create to make maintainable checks, you can use across both tools.
So you could still set that automation, even at unit test level, under the feature files?
Yes, you wouldn't be reading the scenarios out of the feature file.
No,
you'd actually be writing them, you're writing your actual test method names following the given sort of when-then format. You can actually do that, and that's how BDD started out 11 years ago.
That's interesting. That's an interesting fact I didn't know about.
Cool. Thank you, Dan North.
Yeah, Dan's a nice guy as well.
Oh yeah.
So, okay, tell us a little bit about your tool then.
Okay, so Behave Pro, it's an add-on for Jira. So it'll integrate with Jira Cloud and Jira Server, and it allows you to write your scenarios directly on your user stories inside Jira. So when you're doing your specification workshops afterwards and you've gone away and writing it up, you can add your scenarios directly on them. You've got the ability to actually team to vote the user story is ready, so before work starts. People can raise questions and block that from being started. But also, we allow you to, we actually make you organise them by feature. So you actually produce long-term documentation for your project of what functionality is in there.
Wow, that's interesting.
As user stories are adding more scenarios, it will actually replace some scenarios that have already been implemented. So by organising my features, you can see what the software is currently doing.
So how does this implement with the automation behind it then? Because that obviously doesn't sit in Jira as well, you know?
No. So we've done Jira because the business will get involved with it.
Yeah.
If you check your feature files into source control, the business is never going to actually do an SVN checkout or a git clone to go read these files and modify them. So because we don't want them in source control, we actually provide a range of plugins for different build tools. So you've got Maven plugin, a Gradle plugin, Rake task, and MS build task. And what these will do is pull the feature files out of Jira when you want to actually do a test run.
Right, okay.
And put them onto disk for you.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so we put the collaboration aspect of BDD first. You can tell when people are doing BDD correctly or not, or sort of sort of following a good practice. When they start asking questions about the automation and they want to start refactoring scenarios and get those put back into the user stories. Essentially, they're trying to refactor the scenarios to make their automation lives easier by reusing existing automation steps they've created.
Yeah.
But our opinion of that is they're changing the requirements to make their automation lives easier.
Ah, right, okay.
There's simpler ways of actually fixing it. There's 5-minute alternatives in the code to stop that, to get around that problem of duplicate code, rather than changing your requirements to make your automation lives easier.
Yeah. And I suppose if it is in one place, like Jira, then you've got the searching and reporting capabilities there as well within the feature files, right? So
certainly one of the latest features we've done is actually so you can start searching through and actually drill down and navigate via the tags that you can place on the scenarios and features, and what text is involved, so you can do text searching. Reporting is an area we're working on. Everybody wants reporting, but it's really interesting how many different teams do continuous integration, how their release process works, and every team has a different requirement. That is a really interesting challenge, and it's something we're working on. We're actually taking our time over deliberately because we can get it so wrong. If we weren't careful.
Maybe do some dog fooding trials.
We always dog food. We always eat our own dog food.
Yeah.
For Jira Cloud, before we deployed to production, we were actually using it. We have all the sort of features that are turned on for us. So we're using our own product all the time, and that's actually an interesting. That's when we know we haven't done something well, we find it out ourselves. When it's painful for ourselves, it's going to be painful for users, and we fix it that way.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay, so it's been a good conversation. So just to finish off, give us some good BDD resources.
Okay, so any blogs by Liz Keogh, Dan North, Chris Matz, always going to be excellent. There's other people out there. So you've got Konstantin from Invika. He created the BHAT tool. So he does some good blog posts and talks. I've got my own blog on hindsightsoftware.com where I blog about this. So blogs are great. There's conference talks. There is a history of conference talks on this subject. Hasn't reached everybody, so they're on YouTube or they're out on the internet. Lots of discussion on Twitter as well.
Yeah.
So they're all good resources, but then you can get coaches involved.
Yeah, there's usually a lot of good talks about BDD at testing conferences, but is there any specific BDD conferences or?
So you got the sort of BDD and Agile Testing Exchange run by Skills Matter in London, which I think was November last year. So you do get a lot of talks there. You do occasionally get it at developer conferences, but because people have come from BDD from a test point of view, test automation point of view, it does seem to be more the testing conferences.
Yeah, that's interesting because everyone's involved, and including like people like product owners, right? So it's kind of, if it's just at testing conferences, then
there were more product owners, I have to say, this year at the BDD Agile Testing Exchange.
That's cool.
I think the message is starting to hit home.
Yeah.
Certainly in London and the UK. It's different when I go to other parts of the world.
Cool, right, and last question is, what's your favourite book on BDD?
My favourite book on BDD? We mentioned earlier that specification by example is a better name, and I'll actually have to say specification by example.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Or Bridging the Communication Gap, which is sort of the prequel to it.
Oh, okay.
So that will cover more the theory side of communicating. If you want lots of case studies, specification by example is the one to go for.
Yeah, nice. Cool. Well, that's kind of the end of today's podcast. Brilliant. That was great fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Cheers.
Cheers.